Within the folds of modern science appears perhaps the greatest untold story of our generation. It is the simple but seismic truth that the psyche is capable of gleaning information beyond the five senses and all known technology. In plainest terms, this capacity is called extrasensory perception, or ESP. Decades of replicated and bulletproof findings validate this rejected fact of human nature. We are beings both material and immaterial, physically limited and elevated by laws and forces we've only begun to codify. Join me, Mitch Horowitz, as I explore the history, struggles, and proofs of parapsychology, uncovering the extraordinary evidence that ESP is real. Episode 2, Institute for Experimental Religion. As the 20th century dawns, parapsychology is divided between ghost hunters, like Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle, and psi seekers, like a young Sigmund Freud. Although widely considered a materialist counterpart to his more occult-leaning former disciple Carl Jung, Freud nursed little seen but pronounced interest in ESP research, believing in both the prospect of telepathy between analyst and patient, not dissimilar to Mesmer's protégés, as well as clairvoyant or precognitive dreams. In some instances, the father of psychoanalysis posthumously delayed publication of key statements to avoid professional fallout. This was so with Freud's Psychoanalysis and Telepathy, his earliest paper on the topic, written in 1921, but withheld from publication until 1941, 2 years after his death. This was likely at the urging of his English biographer Ernest Jones, who found the topic professionally compromising. Freud's essay contains the passage, "It does not follow as a matter of course that an intensified interest in occultism must involve a danger to psychoanalysis. We should, on the contrary, be prepared to find reciprocal sympathy between them. They both have experienced the same contemptuous and arrogant treatment by official science." Freud occupied one side of a rift that divided many parapsychologists, whether to focus on seeking evidence of life after death or to focus on evidence for the extra-physicality of the psyche. The popular author Doyle, who lost a son in World War I, became a warrior for the after-death thesis. Committed to the existence of another world, Doyle in 1922 wrote his illustrated book, The Coming of the Fairies. Following World War I, the storyteller grew enthralled with photographic plates taken by 2 English schoolgirls that showed winged fairies frolicking in the Yorkshire countryside. Seen through contemporary eyes, the black and white prints hauntingly mirror the hopes of Doyle and others of the World War I generation for a mythical, childlike realm where hidden beings abound and the dead are never really gone. But the images are also appallingly fake. Some of the angelic fairies support stylish Parisian hairdos. They were clipped from fashion magazines, and on scrutiny, one shows a hat pin protruding from its middle. The book became a legacy-staining embarrassment. Yet, it is unlikely that many of Doyle's detractors actually read the strange volume, which, it must be said, has a more lighthearted, even tongue-in-cheek tone than most scoffers surmise. Undeterred, Doyle championed the ectoplasmic and physical conjuring of sketchy American medium Minna Crandon. During this time, Doyle perpetually butted heads with his frenemy, escape maestro and fraudbuster Harry Houdini, who dedicated himself to exposing séance fakery.
You don't have children, Harry, but talk to mine. Ask Jean whether she believes in fairies. She'll tell you she saw one in this very garden, not 10 yards from where we're standing now. Those photographs have been pronounced genuine, not by a theosophist, not by a medium, not by a believer, but by an expert in photographic trickery, Mr. H.R. Snelling of Harrow. Do you have any idea of the implications if he is correct? I'm not sure I do myself.
Doyle's public debates produced an unforeseen outcome. In a lecture on spiritualism the writer delivered in Chicago in May 1922, the same year as the advent of the fairies, he caught the ears of two young, driven statisticians and botanists with dedicated and serious interest in psychical research, a 27-year-old J.B. Rhine and his 30-year-old wife and intellectual partner, Louisa Rhine. Their comity was short-lived. After Chicago, relations between Doyle and the Rhines descended into acrimony. Youthful, ethical, and deeply driven, the former Marine sharpshooter and scientist J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa, then a rare woman scholar trained as a statistician, championed the conservative faction of the Society for Psychical Research, which favored ESP versus after-death research as the field's most logical prospect. Why try to run, the conservatives asked, before you can walk? Educated at the University of Chicago, the Rhines had enough of séance parlors, ectoplasm-emitting mediums, and midnight raps. Rhine, whom Doyle apocryphally called a colossal ass, determined to dedicate parapsychology to lab-based clinical study of mental phenomena. It would be unpardonable for the scientific world today to overlook evidences of the supernormal in our world, J.B. told what must have been a mildly surprised audience of scientific agriculturalists in spring 1926 at the University of West Virginia, where he held a teaching position. The Rhines began casting around, venturing to Columbia University and Harvard, seeking opportunities to combine their scientific training with the metaphysical interests that had ignited their relationship as adolescents. Progress proved fitful. Odd jobs were necessary to stay afloat. Children were soon on the horizon, with the first of four, a boy, adopted in early 1929 after the death of a premature newborn, and 3 daughters born through 1934. I think, too, we are tiring of chasing the psychic rainbow or the philosophic pot of gold, a wearied J.B. wrote in his notes in January 1927. As often occurs in life, just prior to resignation, following immense effort, an extraordinary, and in this case, historic opportunity appeared. The new chairman of Duke's psychology department, William McDougall, a past president of both the American and British SPR, who favored the conservative wing of parapsychology, brought the couple to Durham that fall. In 1930, with the support of Duke's first president, William Preston Few, McDougall made J.B. a formal part of the campus. Few was an interesting figure himself. He had been president of Duke in its earlier incarnation as Trinity College, a Methodist school, and he oversaw its growth, transformation, and renaming in 1924 in honor of its benefactors. Few was eager to establish Duke's reputation and saw J.B. Rhine as part of that effort. To Few, the erudite and energetic researcher might someday write something to top William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. Few's wife was personally interested in ESP, and two of Duke's trustees were active dowsers, an occult water-seeking practice with deep roots in the American South, and supported his work. This firm administrative support of ESP, wrote Mouskoff and McVaugh, had many tangible consequences: provision of a secretary to handle Rhines' correspondence, the establishment of special laboratory quarters for Rhines' staff when the psychology department moved into a new building in the summer of 1935, and steady promotion and raises in salary for Rhine himself. Although the founding of Duke's Parapsychology Laboratory is often dated to that year, JB's program was not christened the Parapsychology Laboratory until 1935. In 1929, he called his prototype the Institute for Experimental Religion. It proved a milestone in which parapsychology was formally folded into an academic structure. At Duke, JB did not quite originate but popularize the phrase extrasensory perception, or ESP, which soon became a household term. But he was interested in far more than minting new labels. JB's hunger as a researcher was to develop clear, repeatable, and unimpeachable methods for testing and statistically mapping evidence for anomalous mental phenomena, if there was any to be found at all. To attempt this, JB created a series of card-guessing tests that involved a deck called Zener cards, designed in the early 1930s by psychologist Carl E. Zener. You may recall seeing Zener card tests affectionately lampooned in the opening scene of Ghostbusters.
Incredible. That's 5 for 5. You can't see these, can you?
No.
You're not cheating me, are you?
No, I swear, they're just coming to me.
Okay. Nervous?
Yes. I don't like this.
You only have 75 more to go. Okay? What's this one?
It's a couple of wavy lines.
Sorry, this isn't your lucky day.
I know. I'm getting a little tired of this.
You volunteered, didn't you? We're paying you, aren't we?
Yeah, but I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks. What are you trying to prove here anyway?
I'm studying the effect of negative reinforcement on ESP ability.
The effect? I'll tell you what the effect is. It's pissing me off.
Well, then maybe my theory is correct.
You can keep the $5. I've had it.
I will, mister.
Stay tuned in for even more extraordinary evidence after the break. Zener cards are a 5-suit deck of 25 cards with symbols easily and immediately recognizable. Circle, square, cross, wavy lines, and 5-pointed star. After a deck is shuffled, subjects guess which symbol will turn up. Over time, and across tens of thousands of trials, guesswork produces a 1 in 5 or 20% hit rate. At a certain point, these odds are lawful. But Rhine discovered, across literally tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of rigorously safeguarded trials, by 1940, the database included nearly 1 million trials, that certain individuals, rather than scoring 20%, would score 25%, 26%, 27%, sometimes 28%, and, in select cases, a great deal higher. In one shattering demonstration, Rhine's star subject between 1931 and 1934, Duke divinity student Hubert Pierce, scored an impossible 25 out of 25 in one sitting. Not one iota of fraud was detected, even following years of skeptical parsing. This must be made clear. In Rhines' experiments, all data were reported. Nothing was withheld in the file drawer, so to speak. No negative sets were excluded. At the time, social scientists commonly withheld negative sets on the questionable grounds that something must be flawed with the methodology. Rhine reversed this practice early on at his lab and helped lead the overall social sciences to do so. Indeed, the first modern meta-analysis in which data from varied experiments are analyzed, validated, or identified as flawed and statistically mapped appeared in Rhine's 1940 monograph, Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years. The term meta-analysis itself was not coined until 1976. In the footsteps of establishing transparent protocols and pooled data, Rhine also included an estimate of how unpublished papers impacted overall effects. This relates to the so-called file drawer problem, or publication bias in favor of results, a common procedural and ethical lapse in the social sciences. Such private information as can be assembled regarding unpublished work, Rhine and his collaborators wrote in Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, shows that by a large majority, the unpublished reports are favorable to ESP rather than non-confirmatory. For many academic researchers, claims of ESP were more daunting than the opposite. In Rhine's trials, every precaution was taken against corruption, withholding, or compromising of data, which was also opened to other researchers, including outspoken critics like English professional skeptic C.E.M. Hansel, for vetting, review, and replication, although few skeptics did their own research. In a March 15, 1960 letter to mathematician and Foundation executive Warren Weaver, Rhine referenced the extra lengths to which the parapsychologist ought to go. Even though the methodology and standards of evidence may compare favorably with other advances of natural science, they have to be superior in parapsychology because of its novelty, and conceivably too, by making them still better, everything may be gained in overcoming the natural resistance involved. The natural resistance or partisanship around such findings can prove so intense and sometimes purposefully obfuscating, if not blatantly false, that even well-intentioned lay seekers are left with the impression that Rhine's work, or that of more recent parapsychologists, has proven non-replicable or compromised. Some people made fun of Duke University at the time, a very prominent university on the American scene today, because it was a school founded on tobacco dollars and people thought of it as a hillbilly school or something of that nature. That's no longer the case, but that was the attitude earlier in the century. Well, had JB wound up at a more prominent institution like Harvard or Columbia, that might have been a nice garland, and that might have helped him write some papers here and there, but he never would have had the institutional support that allowed him to change the culture. So I try to remember that in my own career. You can knock and knock and knock at certain doors, and once in a while those doors will open, but after a while you're going to be bruising your hand, and you're going to ask yourself, is this payoff appropriate and worth it? And that's why I tell that story about JB's institutional support at Duke. It later waned. People retire, people die, newcomers come in, and they're not always going to dig or to understand what an unusual individual on campus or somewhere else is doing. They might have a brief against it for whatever reason, might be unfair. In fact, JB moved his lab off campus in 1965. Now, that was because of a variety of factors, one of which is the Duke's retirement age at that time was 75, and JB didn't want to retire. I would assume he probably could have gotten a waiver of some sort. There was also declining institutional support. He had, fortunately for him, his own network of sponsors, which is absolutely necessary in parapsychology and remains so today. And he successfully took the lab off campus. So he had to roll with that punch. He had to roll with that punch, just 15 years before his death. Maybe that's not how he wanted to spend his retirement years. He wasn't quite retired yet, as I alluded, but maybe he would have been rather dedicated that time to lab work versus making sure there were, paper towels in the men's room and such. But I'm being glib, but still, it's a job to get a lab or any other institution up and running when it's previously been able to depend upon campus or corporate infrastructure. Hard, but he did it, and I think that that's important too. We can't grow transfixed with the ruins of what used to be. We also have to get up and move when it's necessary as well. Psychologist Charles Honorton, about whom more will be heard, sought to analyze critical challenges to Rhines' figures in the years following their publication. In his 1975 presidential address to the Parapsychological Association, a professional society affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Honorton remarked, "Even among parapsychologists, there is a rather widespread belief that most of the independent replication of the early Duke work were non-confirmatory, and I suspect this may be especially true among those of us who were not around in the 1930s, which, incidentally, accounts for about 3/4 of the participants at this convention. In fact, I was surprised myself to find that this wasn't so when I undertook a review of all the English language ESP experiments reported during the period between 1934 and 1939. Honorton's effort involved a database that had swelled into about 3.3 million trials. He continued, "During the 5-year period following publication of J.B. Rhine's monograph, Extrasensory Perception, in 1934, the scientific community responded as it should to any claim of new discovery by disseminating both positive and negative research findings, by careful scrutiny of the experimental and evaluative techniques, and by encouraging fresh replication efforts. During this period, there were approximately 60 critical articles by 40 authors, published primarily in the American psychological literature. 50 experimental studies were reported during this period, 2/3 of which represented independent replication efforts by other laboratories of the Duke University work. Honorton found that 61% of the independent replications of the Duke work were statistically significant. This is 60 times the proportion of significant studies we would expect if the significant studies were due to chance or error. Indeed, Rhine's results have proven sufficiently ironclad so that even close to 50 years later, his most resistant critics were still attempting to explain them by fantastical and often feckless fraud theories, including prominent skeptic Hansel's nearly vaudevillian supposition that during long-distance tests of Hubert Pierce, the subject repeatedly crawled through a ceiling space to peek at cards through a trap door over the lab, a trap door which didn't exist. At such excesses, ideological skeptics fail the test for evaluating miracles posited by 18th century Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, whom skeptics, sometimes without evidently reading him, consider their secular saint. The rationalist icon Hume argued, quite simply, that counterclaims must be less likely than reported phenomena. For all that, Rhine may have proven too idealistic regarding what it took to overcome natural resistance. A prime example appears in how polemical skeptics today ride herd over articles on parapsychology on the most read reference source in history, Wikipedia. In 2023, Wiki's article on Zener cards stated in its opening, the original series of experiments have been discredited and replication has proven elusive. The claim was unsourced. Rhine himself fared little better on Wikipedia. A contemporaneous biographical article on him proved rife with sui generis statements and a plurality of references which typifies Wiki's articles on parapsychology to works issued by Prometheus Books, a Buffalo, New York press aligned with professional skepticism. Rhine's results have never been duplicated by the scientific community, Wikipedia reported. Continuing passively, it was revealed that Rhine's experiments into extrasensory perception, ESP, contained methodological flaws. References to flaws or errors show up 8 times in the article. In an unintentionally humorous passage, professional skeptic Martin Gardner criticizes Rhine for insufficient disclosure regarding fraud, followed by Gardner's suggestion of his own secret knowledge of compromising files hidden in the Rhine labs. In his sumptuously illustrated 2019 book, The Spectacle of Illusion, stage magician and psychologist Matthew Tompkins offered the typically opaque and enduring skeptic's dismissal. Again, note the passive voice and vagueness. Rhine's research methods and lack of scientific rigor were called into question, while attempts by other scientists to replicate his studies failed to produce similar results. The more controls he introduced, the less impressive his results became, and attempts to replicate his results in other laboratories consistently met with failure. Psybusters 1, Scooby Kids 0.
Ghost! Let's get out of here!
But look again. In 2020, parapsychologist Rick Berger, PhD, broke down Rhine's ESP data for the Parapsychological Association. In the 5 years following Rhine's first publication of his results, 33 independent replication experiments were conducted at different laboratories. 20 of these, or 61%, were statistically significant, where 5% would be expected by chance alone. Again, the Parapsychological Association's Honorton noted, "This is 60 times the proportion of significant studies we would expect if the significant results were due to chance or error." Given what I've reviewed, if Rhine's results are a bust, then the methods used for statistical measurement since the inception of modern science and all the data so amassed must likewise be considered so. Faced with these alternatives, logician David Hume himself would, by his own model, concede Rhine's data. Lettered people, educated people are wrong all the time. There were famously cases, for example, going back into history in the 16 and 1700s, where villagers would report shooting stars, remarkable lights in the sky, and these later turned out to be meteorites or meteorite storms at a period of time when people in the few colleges and royal academies that studied astronomy weren't looking for such phenomena or were skeptical toward the existence of such phenomena, and when reported, villagers were dismissed as backwards hayseeds or superstitious folk or something of that nature. And if you look at anything that's entered our culture that's now become mainstream that would have been foreign to us 150 years ago, and this includes the practice of cremation, which is now the favored funerary practice in America. It's practiced in the case of more than 50% of interments. Cremation was alien to this country in the late 19th century. It was considered something that belonged to the pagan past or something that was practiced in faraway exotic Eastern cultures. It was reintroduced, or rather introduced, to modern Westerners by Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a retired Civil War colonel who was partners with the Russian occultist Madame H.P. Blavatsky, and together they co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York. When Colonel Olcott held a cremation memorial service, there were near riots in the city. It was called a pagan funeral in the press, and people thought it was a heretical outrage against proper Christian and Western practice. Well, new ideas not infrequently enter from the fringes. This is true of psychedelic drugs, which are being increasingly used, obviously, for therapeutic purposes. This is true of widespread practices like yoga or intermittent fasting or acupuncture or various kinds of physical therapy or vegetarian, vegan, or macrobiotic diets. All these things are fairly widespread across the country today, even if they're practiced by a minority of people, but their entry point to the culture came from the fringes. So the lettered classes have never necessarily been predictive of what's going to become mainstream practice tomorrow, but I'm not interested in a popularity contest. Whether something becomes mainstream or not is irrelevant to its validity as a subject, and the inability to take seriously non-physicalist, non-material premises is a huge blind spot as we progress into this century. There is a gross chasm between what's actually going on in theoretical physics journals, for example, the adventurousness of articles by working physicists about the perceptual nature of reality, and what you'll encounter on Wikipedia. It's a disability to educated people to immediately box check the consensus of their cultural milieu. It's a mistake. It's wrong on the facts. That's part of what this podcast is all about. And so there's a factual basis to this story. There's a historical basis to this story. There's human pathos in this story. But there's also a cultural aspect to it. And I think it subliminally is woven throughout.
In laboratories during the last decade, evidence has been accumulating that psychic abilities may have some scientific basis after all.
The majority of the scientific community doesn't believe in the existence of psychic phenomena, and I'm afraid that demonstrates that the majority of the scientific community is simply ignorant.
More extraordinary evidence when we return. Even if parapsychology as a field had ended with Rhines' initial Duke trials, if no further experiments occurred, we would possess evidence of extraphysical mechanics in human existence. Those basic, though painstakingly structured, Zener card experiments, those few percentage points of deviation tracked across tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of trials, 90,000 appeared in the database by the 1934 publication of Extrasensory Perception, demonstrate anomalous transfer of information in a laboratory setting and extraphysical, call it metaphysical, non-Newtonian exchange of information. But things did not end there. In the decades ahead, extraordinary waves of diversified experiments occurred in the U.S. and other nations, growing from the efforts of Duke's Parapsychology Lab. These efforts demonstrated again and again anomalous mental phenomena, including precognition, telepathy, and psychokinesis, PK, or mind over matter. Rhines' lab began studying PK in 1934, an effort that continued until 1941, after which many staffers were summoned to the war effort. During about 9 years of investigation, researchers conducted tens of thousands of runs in which subjects attempted to effect throws of random sets of dice. Devices tossed dice in such a way that ensured no pattern whatever.
Rhine did thousands of trials on hundreds of people. This one tests mind over matter. Affect the fall of dice to make, say, double six.
5-1. 2-1.
Constant testing was necessary because for statistical proof, they needed consistent scores above chance.
Again, similar statistical results to the Zener card experiments appeared among certain individuals across hundreds of thousands of throws with every conceivable safeguard, peer review, methodological transparency, and reportage of every set. There appeared a deviation of several percentage points suggesting a physical effect arising from mental intention. Parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove has noted, by the end of 1941, a total of 651,216 experimental die throws had been conducted. The combined results of these experiments pointed to a phenomenon with 10,115 to 1 odds against chance occurrence. In years ahead, Rhine is feted in the media and proves the perfect spokesman for parapsychology. Handsome, poised, reassuring, and angular, the ex-Marine holds forth with relaxation and good humor in interviews, speaking in a clipped mid-Atlantic accent. If Hollywood had sought a leading man to play Rhine, it would be a toss-up between Cary Grant and Burt Lancaster. As always in life, however, seeds of adversity take root in the midst of success. Although an impeccable researcher, Rhine's campus support rests on a handful of administrators. While some faculty disdain him as a proto-mystic, the parapsychologist simultaneously proves too conservative for some younger figures in the field who want him to go further in philosophically extrapolating from his results and providing a theory of conveyance, a topic that returns to haunt him. As I see it, the pioneer's blind spot was overprivileging charisma, charm, and public appeal among protégés. This last trait led Rhine to overlook and even alienate a young, brilliant newcomer who soon had to abandon the Duke's Circle in order to take parapsychology into its next epical stage. Thank you for listening to Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. This series was produced by Jim Perry and John McEdward for Spectre Vision Radio. Edited by John McEdward, with original music by Dean Hurley. Written and narrated by me, Mitch Horowitz. Join us for Episode 3, Mushroom X, where we encounter the scientist with whom J.B. Rhine never quite connected and who died tragically young, but not before revolutionizing the field.
From here, weather permitting, our chartered plane will fly us to a remote mountain village to look for, of all things, a mushroom. But a very strange mushroom indeed, with powers beyond belief.